Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Tabor Conover. I'm the head of public programs here at Connecticut's Old State House, and we're delighted to welcome you to today's conversation at noon entitled, "The Ballot is Stronger Than the Bullet, A Short History of Voting." Today's program caps off a month of programs focused on elections as we near, within a week, the national elections. Welcome to all of our visitors who are watching this program on Facebook Live or on our YouTube channel. I want to invite you as you're watching to put any questions you might have in the comments section of each of those platforms, because we will be monitoring them throughout the program and asking them of our speaker later in today's program. I'd also like to just bring your attention to the fact that the survey is posted in the comments as well, and to invite you to fill out the survey following watching this program. We're really delighted today to be able to welcome back an old friend of the Old State House. In normal times, he'd be actually teaching a college class here in our building. Hamish Lutris is an associate professor of history and political science at our neighbor Capital Community College here in Hartford, Connecticut. We're so happy to have Hamish back with us to do another program. He's one of our most popular speakers who's spoken here at the Old State House. Hamish has worked in some of America's premier natural and historical sites, leading hiking and historical programs, and he's lectured extensively throughout the United States, Europe, and Canada, presenting programs on a wide range of historical topics, including Native American history, the Civil War, scientific history, social and cultural history, World War I, World War II, and the American West, and then, of course, today on voting rights. Welcome, Hamish.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out and seeing, or actually not coming out, but hopefully staying home and seeing the talk as well. Today, as part of Connecticut's Old State House series on various types of political issues that may be of interest to us, we're going to be talking about voting and voting rights throughout history. Now, I've entitled my talk, "The Ballot is Stronger Than the Bullet." And this is a statement made by President Abraham Lincoln during his administration in talking about the importance of voting back then. Now, as we look at voting, folks, one of the things I like to kind of lead off with is a statement made in 1965 in the lead up to the Voting Rights Act. Lyndon Johnson once talked about the importance of voting, and he said, "A man without a vote is a man without protection." And indeed, throughout history, and especially in Western history, we have found that voting is one of the biggest safeguards we have to the rights of the everyday people. It is not at all a new practice. It's not something that began in the United States, but it is something that we actually have kind of a unique structure for. Indeed, voting began way back in history, and in Greece, in fact, there were a couple of ways that you could vote. Now, first of all, when Greeks voted, they didn't vote for a candidate for an office. In fact, what they usually did was voted in two ways. One was called spoliation, and that is known as election by lottery. Now, what does that mean, folks? Well, what it means is very simple. Every week until October, Connecticut's Old State House holds a farmer's market, and that in Athens would have been called the Agora. And so if they wanted you to be part of the voting public at any time, they would make you join a body called the Ecclesia. The way they did that was to come out to the market at the height of business and simply rope off the market and force everybody into a stadium so that they could vote on issues. As you can imagine, folks, this was not a very popular position to be in. And in fact, many people, seeing the officials come out with their ropes, ran for home. Now, the officials were ready for this, and they had soldiers standing by with whips dipped in red paint. And as people ran by to go home and avoid the duty of voting, they actually would whip the people so that everybody would know by the red stripes on their clothing that they had neglected their political duties. But there was another way that the Greeks voted as well, and this was also kind of an unconventional way to us, and that was the voting for ostracization. What you're looking at are actually four little shards of pottery, and these are called ostracons. And what people would do every year is put the names of people they didn't like on these ostracons, and they would send them into the political offices. If you got enough votes, you were kicked out of Athens for a year. And so this kind of voting, as far as I'm concerned, is a little bit more edgy than what we have in the United States. But we do see that voting was considered an extremely important activity even back then. Now, in the Roman Empire, voting took place not on the upper levels of government. You didn't vote for your censors or your praetors. You did vote, however, for local magistrates and officials. And there, the campaigning was fierce. We really don't know exactly how the Romans voted. They never left a record of exactly what their procedure was, how they checked for accuracy. But we do know that when Romans voted in municipal elections, massive amounts of money changed hands. Bribery and generally providing people with food, with wine, was generally considered one of the great ways to get votes, and people exercise this all the time. Now, as we move forward, however, and the Roman Empire begins to give way toward a more medieval Europe, what we is that now there are going to be Germanic tribes moving in. Now, the Germanics are different than the Romans, because the Germanics generally are going to elect their kings. They do not care about inherited kingship. They care about prowess in battle. And so the man that you see in the middle of this picture, holding the staff and the sword, is actually a king who has been elected into that power. In the 10th century, in fact, Abbot Elfric of Eisenham, who is in England, actually wrote, "No man can make himself a king, but the people has the choice to choose a king as they please. After he is consecrated as king, he then has dominion over the people, and they cannot shake his yoke off their necks." The simple fact of the matter is, kings very often were going to be elected all over the map in Europe. And in fact, here in the 900s, we find the oldest living parliament in the world, the Athling. And this is in Iceland. And here they actually began the practice of universal male suffrage. That is, all men on the island over 20 years old had the ability to speak and vote in the Athling. And decisions were generally come to through a unanimous or kind of consensus rule, and through the noise of the crowds who would vote yes or no on the measures. And what we also find, however, is that all over Europe, we are going to find elected kingships. In Poland, in Hungary, the Holy Roman Empire, all of these places are going to actually elect rather than inherit their kings. And so this is a very common practice. And when we want to remember that implicit with the right to elect your king is the right to de-elect your king. And we're going to start running into that as well fairly soon. Now, another way of voting was this one, probably not too popular as well. This is the Republic of Venice. And in the Republic of Venice, which is in northern Italy, right up to about the 1700s, they used spoliation as well. Every single citizen's name was put on small balls. And these balls were put into an office in the Venice Council's chambers. And then a young boy called a ballottino would take the balls out of the casks, have the names with him, and he would actually literally run them over to the head of the Council of Venice. From this boy, who is called a ballottino, we get the word ballot from. And so they would run over, they would get this. Now, this is completely random, folks, which means that if you're in Venice, at any time, somebody may come to your door at the end of the day and say, for the next 2 years, you're going to be on the Venice Council. And so I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing. I'm sure there are people who are happy about it. I'm sure there were probably people who tried to make sure that they weren't home when such people were going to knock on the doors. Also, we find in indigenous tribes in all over the world, but especially in Native America, what we will find is that Native Americans often elected their chiefs, and usually for two reasons. They would elect a hunt chief, somebody who was very good in the hunt. Whatever they were going for, they could actually gather bands of people around them, sometimes gather power, sometimes a war chief, somebody who was good at raiding. Here is that the chiefs would be elected for the purposes of a hunt or of a raid. If it went very well, they may be able to persist and they may be able to carry out more hunts and raids, but this position was always subject to two pieces of oversight. Number one, continued success, because as soon as you didn't do well in a hunt, you were going to be de-elected hunt chief and somebody else would come and do the job. Number two, approval of the women. Very often in Native American societies, women had a great deal of voice in who ran the government. And if you were going to be nominating a chief, one of the things you wanted to take into account was the idea that 50% of the tribe was going to have a strong voice in that procedure. But in reality, folks, when we're in the United States and we're talking about where we get the idea of why and how we vote, it's really going to be from England and from Great Britain. After all, the English are very, very conscious of the fact that as individual Englishmen, they have a right to have a voice in their government. Indeed, after the accession of William III, a man named John Locke, a doctor and a philosopher, said, "It is evident that absolute monarchy, that is, monarchy without any limits on it, is indeed inconsistent with civil society, and so can be no form of civil government at all." And so, in England during the 1700s, we begin to get two parties. One party was pro-king, and they're known as the Tories. And even today, if you're in England and you look at the Conservatives, they're often called the Tories. The people who are anti-king were generally called the Whigs. And this is spelled W-H-I-G. It's not about a hairpiece, folks. These folks generally opposed what the king was going to do. And here we begin to find that there now are two choices for almost every political office we see. And so in England, throughout the 17 and then the 1800s, we're going to find voting rights expand, especially in the middle of the 1800s. We're going to find a great movement arise. And this movement gives rise to a word called liberal, and that is the Chartist movement. The picture you're looking at right now details hundreds and in fact thousands of working men who are demonstrating for expanded voting rights. And what they had was a charter. They would submit these to the king, queen, or parliament, and this Chartist movement really went a long way toward expanding the rights of people to vote in England and influencing the rest of Europe. Now, what they wanted was actually pretty simple. And I'm going to show you what they wanted and then the year that they received these as for the Chartist movement. First, they wanted universal suffrage. That is, they wanted every man who was of sound mind and not undergoing punishment for a crime to have the vote. Indeed, they got this in 1918. They wanted a secret ballot, so that you could actually make your vote in secret so that nobody could know what you did and try to intimidate you. They got that in 1872. They had no property qualification for members of parliament. In other words, folks, you could live in an apartment and still be a member of parliament. Up until then, you had to be a major landowner, which meant very few people could actually vote in England. They also wanted payment for members of parliament, and in 1911, both the property qualification and payment went through. Now, why would you want to pay your members of parliament? It's pretty simple, folks. If you don't pay your members of parliament, they have to live on their own money. Therefore, only the rich can be members of parliament. By doing this, political offices were opened up to virtually everyone in the society. Also, they wanted equal constituency areas. Some people, if they were representing London, represented literally hundreds of thousands of people. Other people in rural areas, maybe they only represented a few hundred. These were going to be equalized, and they got that in 1867. There's one more thing in that they wanted annual parliamentary elections to prevent corruption, but they have never gotten this. However, the Chartist movement really sets the tone for much of Western voting. Now, in Europe, much of the voting is really done on kind of a ranked basis. So we vote for parties, we might have the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the Labor Party, the Green Party, and whoever gets the most votes, up to 50%, you're going to be able to form a government. Now, if you can't get 50%, folks, what you're going to have to do is one of two things. Either you're going to have to make a coalition with other people to gather your 50%, or you're going to have a runoff election. And so this type of voting has advantages. Everyone's voice is heard. Even small parties might have a lot of power, because if the Labor Party got 48% and the Green Party was only 4%, it would still give Labor enough to make a majority government. Now, the United States won't go this way. And in fact, the United States is really going to have a slightly different process, and it's going to be a little more complicated. Now, when the American colonies made their independence from England in 1776 and later fought the War of Independence from 1775 to 1783, everyone knew that the newly born United States was going to be a very different country than anyone who had come before. The reason? Very simple. From the beginning of our history, it had been said that voting was an essential part of all of the political processes. The first man who's going to talk about this is a man well known to Hartford, Connecticut. His name is Thomas Hooker, and he's one of the people who settled this area. And then in May of 1638, Thomas Hooker said of people, Thomas Hooker advocated for every man having a vote in order to vote for the people who are holding state or local offices. And for this, Hooker is given the nickname the father of American democracy. Now, this is the beginnings of it, yet in 1776, this man will give us something to shoot for, a spiritual document, although it wasn't really designed this way. It's known as the Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration of Independence, most of you probably are already familiar with the most famous line, which is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, it's a beautiful line, folks. It's a great thing for us to shoot for. But more than that, very precisely, it means that since all men are created equal, they should all deserve an equal voice in what kind of event they have in front of them. And so, from the very beginnings, we thought about voting and voting rights in the United States. Now, in the beginning, we were thinking about voting rights basically for white men only. And in fact, not only just white men, but white men who were holders of property. Now, almost immediately, this idea is going to come under fire. Now, we see this first right around the time of the Declaration of Independence, because when that line is written, it's a beautiful line, but we also know today that when we say all men are created equal, people will object. But does this include women? Also at the time, it didn't really include minorities. Well, Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, had something to say about this in a letter to her husband. And what she said was, remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. From the beginnings of the history of the United States, women and people who we now would call minorities have been fighting assiduously to get their voting rights awarded to them. Now, when the Constitution is made, originally, the Constitution included a few different types of voting. Now, first of all, if you wanted to vote for people in the House of Representatives, you could do so. You had to be over 21, you had to be a white male, you had to be a property holder. However, you did not vote for senators. Senators were elected by state legislatures. You did not vote for Supreme Court justices. Those were appointed by the president and approved of by the Senate. And in fact, you were not going to elect the president directly either. Although many people today talk about having what is called a direct election of the president, in fact, during the Constitutional Convention, originally the president was slated to be elected by Congress. When this idea came forward in August of 1787, it was one of the last things debated in the Constitutional Convention. This man objected strenuously. His name is Gouverneur Morris. And Morris is an interesting figure when it comes to the Constitution. Many of the words that we read in the document itself would come from Gouverneur Morris. He was brilliant with the language, but he also said, if Congress will elect the president by itself. It will be the work of intrigue, of cabal, and of faction. He did not trust Congress to be able to elect a president fairly. However, everybody in the Constitutional Convention said, yeah, but at the same time, we don't want people's direct voices in the government because we might end up getting somebody who looks good or talks good, but really isn't that good. And so a compromise is made. And thus, when we elect a president, we elect the president through the Electoral College. For every representative and senator that we have, we are allowed one electoral vote. And those votes are going to go to the president. Now, here's where we differ from Europe. In the United States, we use what is called a first past the post election style. That means as soon as somebody gets 51% of anything, they win it all. They don't have to worry about making coalitions with people. And thus we find that either one party or another will generally kind of come out on top in every election. We find a lot of advantage in this. It focuses political will. We also find that politics tends to be a little more driven in this way because there's not constant maneuvering between various factions of coalitions. However, as we went on in our history, in 1819, the country underwent its first major depression. And in the Panic of 1819, the call for a wider array of voting was very loud, and it was finally listened to. After the Panic of 1819, property qualifications will be taken away, and thus all white males over 21 will be allowed the vote. Now, what's going to happen, however, is that, as you can tell, this is not going to be a satisfactory state of affairs for a lot of people. And in fact, the women of the United States in the 1820s and 30s began to come together, but in the 1840s, they made the first positive steps toward what would be called the first wave of feminism, or the suffragette movement. And that is here in 1848. The ladies that you're looking at in this picture actually created something called the Seneca Falls Declaration. There are just a couple I wanted to point out. First, and you might notice her from $1 that we have in coins, Susan B. Anthony is one person. And then here, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, probably the most famous of the suffrage activists during the 19th century. The one who actually started it all, however, is on Elizabeth Cady Stanton's left, and her name is Lucretia Mott. And actually, the reason they started this was because in the 1840s, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton went to an London, England meeting of abolitionist societies. So these ladies were very much into suffrage for women and into an anti-slavery movement. What they found out was that women weren't allowed to speak at the abolitionist meeting in London. They were forced to go to another room and just be told what had happened by the men who actually had been in the meeting. And so in 1848, they will actually object to this, and they will launch the suffrage movement with the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. And there they say, in view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half the people in this country, there's social and religious degradation, and here, of course, they're referring to women, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. Now, from 1848 on, therefore, suffrage for women becomes one of the hottest political topics we will have in the United States right up until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Now, I'll get to that in a second, but there's a second part of the move to suffrage, and that is, during the Civil War, we're also going to get a couple of little wrinkles in this. Now, first of all, you are looking at Abraham Lincoln right now, and make no mistake about it, you are looking at probably one of the most successful political manipulators that has ever sat in the White House. And in 1864, knowing that he was going to be in trouble in the election nationally that year, he instituted something called the absentee ballot, so that soldiers could vote and actually kind of, instead of coming home and going off of the line, they could actually vote for him by mail. And indeed, folks, many people believe that that soldier's vote was something that really put Lincoln over the top in many cases and in many states. But there was something else facing Lincoln at this time, and that is the problem of abolition. What were we to do about people when we freed them from enslavement? Should they have full civil rights? Should they be allowed the full rights that everybody else has had now for about 80 years? Well, it's interesting. Lincoln himself, although he passed the Emancipation Proclamation, and although he oversaw the passage of the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which did see the end of slavery, he was actually very kind of lukewarm and wishy-washy on this issue. The only real indication we have of Lincoln's feelings on this is here. On April 11th, 1865, 3 days before he was assassinated, Lincoln said, "It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise, that is the vote, is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers." This is as far as Lincoln goes. But many people believe that now that African Americans have fought for the American flag, that they deserve the full citizenship and the rights of that citizenship that are encased in the vote. Now, of course, 3 days later, Lincoln is assassinated. And as you can see by this political cartoon, people who came after him found his shoes very difficult to fill. And so a lot of people began to get active about the suffrage issue for African Americans. However, the issue was not going to go too far. Now, Frederick Douglass said, actually, and made a lot of sense doing it, said, if we are called on to do military duty against the rebel armies in the field, why should we be denied the privilege of voting against rebel citizens at the ballot box? The latter is as necessary to save the government as the former. And in fact, he makes this case very eloquently. However, by the 1870s, most African Americans in the country, being based in the southern United States, have been effectively barred from voting. They were going to do this through a bunch of different ways. You could pass laws to do this, things like, very famous, the Grandfather Clause, which said, if your grandfather voted, then you have the right to vote as well. Very few African Americans in the South could say that. They might use a poll tax. Everybody has to pay a certain amount of money, and then you can vote. But most farmers, white or black, did not have any cash money on them. And so the law would be selectively enforced, and therefore, basically, white votes would be counted, black votes would not. And so by the end of the 1870s, for the most part, African Americans were barred from voting in the South, and therefore the majority were barred from voting anywhere. We did have some flashes of a possible African-American movement into government. Now here, for instance, is a poster of the South Carolina government about 1870. And so we did begin to actually kind of instill voting rights on African-Americans. But as I said, by the end of the 1870s, all of this is kind of put to rest. And what we find is that we are not going to have the same freedom for African-Americans to vote for nearly 100 years. Frederick Douglass, in fact, said, to the freedmen was given the machinery of liberty, but there was denied to them the steam to put it in motion. And so, at this point, in the 1870s and 80s, African Americans are fighting for the right to vote. Female suffragettes are right next to them fighting for the same thing. But by the 1890s, these two movements have split. And suffragettes began to go on basically a women-only movement. African Americans began to lag behind. In 1892, the right to suffrage, that is the right to vote, was dropped by the Republican Party, Lincoln's party, as a plank of their platform. And since then, it's really going to be African Americans themselves who fought for the right to vote. But at this point, the people who are going to get that right, and through the 1880s, 90s, and into the 1900s, suffragettes will be marching all over the country. Now, women were beginning to get the right to vote in a few different places. Wyoming, for instance, gave women the right to vote in 1869. In Montana, a woman took over for her husband when he died and actually served as the governor of Montana and then was reelected as the governor of Montana. So what we do see is that there are progresses being made, but it's really going to be the demonstrations in the street that will finally award us what we call the 19th Amendment. And in 1920, women will be given the right to vote in the United States. Now, when they're given the right to vote, we should also realize a couple of things. They weren't really given the right to vote solely because people woke up to the fact that women deserved that right. The communists in Russia had already given full civil rights and equality to women, and therefore in the United States by 1920, we're playing catch up. In fact, England does not give women the right to vote until 1928, and there were a couple of countries in Central and Eastern Europe that didn't give women the right to vote until the 1970s. And so, folks, what we find is that the progress is going to be slow, but actually we're not going to do too badly for ourselves as far as women go. Now, at the same time, African Americans by 1900 seem to kind of be lagging behind completely. In 1909, a new organization is formed. It is called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. And their mission statement originally said that their purpose was to advance the interest of colored peoples, colored citizens, to secure for them impartial suffrage, and to increase their opportunities for securing justice in the courts, education for their children, employment according to their ability, and complete equality before the law. And when the NAACP begins to get involved, folks, the NAACP doesn't demonstrate. They bring lawsuits. And what they're going to do is hire lawyers. There will be challenging segregation, challenging what we call Jim Crow laws at every turn. Now, at first, this success is going to be slow. It's not going to come quickly. It's not going to come easily. But by the end of World War II, the worm seems to be turning. And now there will be massive demonstrations after the war that are going to demand that African Americans be given the right to vote. This is not going to happen without resistance, folks. In 1961, college students from the North went down into the South to travel with African Americans throughout the South, small towns where they would go and register people to vote. They were known as the Freedom Riders. And the Freedom Riders, it sounds like a really great romantic thing to do, but as you can see, the Freedom Riders ran into a great deal of resistance. This is the scene in 1961, just after a bus has been firebombed. And so somebody threw a smoke bomb into it, the bus catches on fire, everybody has now gotten out, but you might notice the guy in the front, he's still kind of choking from all of the smoke that had been in there and the fire. So there's going to be a lot of violence. People will die during this time. However, in the 1960s, there are a few things about the African American suffrage movement that are going to make it very different from what had come in the 1800s. First of all, the African American suffrage movement now has a very powerful spokesman in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be one of the first people who begins to speak up about the violence happening against African Americans trying for that vote in the South. And what he says, and here he's speaking to President Lyndon Johnson just before 1965, he said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." And to many African Americans, the vote was something that mattered more than anything else since 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment. Well, there's also going to be other voices coming in at this time. While Dr. Martin Luther King is an eloquent spokesman for African Americans to receive their rights, there are other people who are not so patient about it. In 1963, this man is going to really appear on the scene as a powerful counterweight to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His name is Malcolm Al-Shabazz, or Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, and here, in fact, I always found this picture interesting. You might notice the Connecticut State Capitol right behind him. He's visiting Hartford. Now, Malcolm X spoke a little bit differently than Martin Luther King did. In 1964, he gives a speech, and his speech is called the Ballot or the Bullet. And in that speech, he says, the black nationalists aren't going to wait. Lyndon B. Johnson is the head of the Democratic Party. If he's for civil rights, let him go into the Senate next week and declare himself. If he waits too long, brothers and sisters, he will be responsible for letting a condition develop in the country, which will create a climate that will bring seeds up out of the ground with vegetation on the end of them looking like something these people never dreamed of. In 1964, it's the ballot or the bullet. This was a much more urgent message. And by now, people are beginning to see that if they don't award the vote to African Americans, the fundamental promise of all men being equal in the United States is going to be actually compromised by this. And so in 1964, in the second of the three famous Civil Rights Act passed, Lyndon Johnson, here greeting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the signing of the Voting Rights Act, will happen in 1965. This is the first page of the Voting Rights Act, and this guarantees to people the right to vote regardless of race, color, or creed. Now, this I should say the 1965 Civil Rights Act, all right, did guarantee African Americans the right to vote, and it's actually been quite successful since then in maintaining that right. Although now we're beginning to see movement against it as well. There's a great deal of talk now about restricting voters' rights, restricting them through production of identifications or driver's licenses. But the simple fact is that since 1965, people have gotten extremely comfortable with the fact that voting means power in the United States. So much so that by 2008, only 43 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which really favored African Americans, this man, Barack Obama, was elected president, a man widely known of as African American. Now, when President Obama speaks about voting, what he says is actually quite clear. There's no such thing as a vote that doesn't matter, he says. It all matters. And so to close my program, I just wanted to tell you that you kind of have to agree with President Obama in this. No matter which way you vote, it's a really good thing to do. Even if you're in a place like Lutris, Texas, and you want to vote for a goat for the mayor of your town, I guess that's going to be okay, as long as you are exercising that political right. And I'd like to close my program with just a short quote from a man who actually seems to be a major political thinker today, even though he's actually a comedian on TV. And that is, I hope that everybody here will do what Stephen Colbert tells you to do, which is, can't wait for tomorrow when I get to exercise my patriotic duty as an American, complaining about how long it's taking to vote. But folks, long lines means lots of people are voting. I hope you guys can get out there as well. Well, thank you very much. That's my presentation for today. I'd like to just kind of close it out by saying, once again, the ballot is stronger than the bullet. We hope you exercise your right tomorrow, or when we do have the election next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it, Hamish. We do have some audience questions, so I'd invite anyone who's watching out there on Facebook Live or on YouTube that we are monitoring the comment section. So please share your questions, your comments, fill out your survey. We do have a couple of questions that have already come in. And the first of those is, who are some of the people, groups who are still fighting for the right to vote in the U.S. today?
In the United States, well, at this point, almost a lot of people who call themselves minority groups of a lot of stripes are still fighting for that right. Now, the 1965 Civil Rights Act gives you the right to vote, but it's important to remember that in order to exercise that right, in order to maintain it, very often you're going to have to fight for it, and demonstrations will occur. Now, when I say fight, I don't mean physically, but you're going to have to get out there on the streets, demonstrate for it, and make sure that people can see that voting is taking place. Today, a lot of the fighting about voting rights really doesn't have to do with people literally being held off at gunpoint from a voting poll or a polling place. Instead, it's more subtle. By redistricting voting districts, for instance, we can minimize the number of districts that will actually go one party or another, depending on who's doing that redistricting. We can also limit voting rights by limiting polling machines. You know, if 1,000 people were to come into Connecticut's old State House to vote, let's say, and we had 10 machines, that means through the day, 100 people each, you could probably handle that. On the other hand, if we had 20,000 people coming through here and you only have 2 machines, it's going to be awful tough for people to get to vote. And I've been reading about Ohio. A lady said that in Ohio, she waited to vote early, and she actually waited 13 hours. 13, this is not a mistake. She waited literally the entire day to vote. For many people, voter registration, restriction of voter registration, and restriction of the physical ability to vote, that is, the availability of machines, this is really standing in the way. And so a lot of the activism this year has had to do, one way or the other, with how accessible voting is.
And one thing also I noticed a couple months ago, I think it was, that there are restrictions on people who've been convicted of a crime.
That's correct.
And that I think it was former Mayor Bloomberg who actually paid some of the fines for former felons that they were able to vote.
That's exactly correct. And right now, there's a huge debate on this. The original English law, which is really held pretty much standard almost throughout the European world, and that includes the US and Canada, really talks about basically anybody being able to vote as long as you are not a convicted felon. Now, How we deal with this afterwards is very difficult. There are some crimes you can be convicted of and you won't be able to vote again. Others that you can't. However, if you do owe money, for instance, on a fine, you can't vote. And so a lot of these problems are arising as well, especially since the United States does possess a large percentage of the number of incarcerated people in the world.
Interesting. Thank you. One of our comments that's come through asks, when suffragettes and Black voters separated, which line did the Black women follow?
This is one of the most ironic things about the drive toward suffrage, is that actually the suffrage movement was becoming so popular in the 1870s and 80s. While, as we know, African-American men are being barred from voting in the South, that actually the situation arose for many suffragettes that was ridiculous to their minds. That is, that actually if they were successful, it might be the case that Black women could vote and Black men could not. This was a big reason for them to actually split the movements. But the other one was, and it's very simple, and it gets down to something a little grainier than that. And that is that as the 19th century wore on after the Civil War, there's really two choices the American people saw: reconciliation with North and South, or a continued emphasis on advocating for African Americans to have full civil rights. And quite frankly, the nation really did, I think it's an opinion, but I think it's a pretty defensible one. The nation basically chose reconciliation over African American voting rights. And that's why they're not going to come in really until the NAACP leads the way.
Thank you. Another viewer has asked, what are your thoughts on compulsory voting? I think Australia has that.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, a friend of mine in Belgium said the same thing, that they had to go out and vote. Actually, you could probably make a case for it. I don't know how it would work out, because if you have compulsory voting, you might also be opening yourself up to different forms of corruption that we haven't seen before. But one of the problems with voting, and I will tell you that this is not only in the United States, all over Europe, the same thing, is that essentially you can't get a lot of people who are registered to vote to come out. This is one of the things that, for instance, the president election shows us, is that the election's not about convincing people as much as what they call motivating the base, getting them out to do this. Now, normally speaking, we only have about 1/3 of registered voters actually, or 1/3 of eligible voters actually voting. But this year, apparently, they're talking about more turnout than we've had since 1908. And that bodes well for the number of people who are voting, either way, whichever way they're going to go.
Because the question was really asking if you felt that it took away from democracy you're forcing people to vote, or is it making sure that all voices are heard?
Yeah, and see, this is the problem. Until we try it and know the problems that will come with it, we really don't know. It seems to work well in Belgium, but Belgium's a smaller country. It's a little bit more homogeneous than the United States is. I'm not really sure what would happen afterwards. You can make the case, however, that it would be a good thing to do, because it would involve the everyday citizen more closely with his or her government.
And I know in the past few years, sometimes Belgium has gone a year or so with no formed government.
That's
because
right.
They're more parliamentary.
Right.
Steve Thornton, who's one of our friends, hello, Steve, if you can't vote if you haven't paid a fine, isn't that an illegal poll tax?
Again, too, it depends on who's making the argument and for what. The thing about a poll tax is that a poll tax is really something. First of all, a poll tax was something that in the South, if you really wanted to enforce that law, a lot of people wouldn't have been able to vote. It was enforced selectively. But a poll tax is also something that we consider, because of the fact that we are Americans and vote for our government, we consider a poll tax to be something we have a voice in. Whereas conviction for a crime is probably not something we have a voice in. I'm not going to convict myself of a crime. And so there might be a difference there.
And Mariana asks, what can you tell us about English language proficiency tests as a requirement for immigrants to vote?
Well, this is actually something that, one thing you'll find is that in the United States, there is no official language. And in many places, you can actually do things in many different languages. But the fact of the matter is, the United States, from the beginning of its history, has considered itself, and in the words of, I believe it was Luis Muñoz Rivera, an early Puerto Rican political thinker, he said that the United States was a state of states, a nation of nations. In other words, the United States doesn't really care so much about the language you use as the responsibility that you bear toward your government. And so really, having an English language requirement is something that could be argued with. In the present climate, you might find it very popular because we have tended to be much more nationalistic all over the West in the last 20 years than we had before. I'm not sure that it would be something that you could test for very easily, because one of the things they used to do in the Reconstruction South is called literacy tests. And so I would ask somebody, for instance, you would come in to vote, and I would say, can you spell cat? Can you write your name on a piece of paper? You say yes. Now, if I want to keep you from voting, that's easy, because when you come in, your test is different. Can you spell, please, chrysanthemum for me? And now who knows what's going to happen? Right. As a matter of fact, one African-American man who went in to vote during Reconstruction was asked not only to read from the Bible, which he could do, he was quite literate, but he was asked finally, how many angels can stand on the head of a pin? I'm not sure what he was supposed to say. And he finally just lost his temper. He said, I don't know, how many? And they simply barred him from voting because he didn't pass the literacy test. Mm-hmm. So we've got to be careful with that too. How are we going to administer such tests?
Yeah, and it seems like that was something that was more kind of based on individual states, not a national.
Yes, that's also very, very true.
Another question we have is that any U.S. citizen who resides in Puerto Rico or other unincorporated territories is effectively disenfranchised at the federal level.
That's correct.
But they can vote if they move to the mainland. What are your thoughts on this constitutional limbo?
It's funny. I'm teaching a course in the history of Puerto Rico right now. So it's this constitutional limbo has been in place since about 1901, when the first of a series of Supreme Court cases came before the Supreme Court called the insular cases. And in this, Puerto Ricanos at first were considered to be, how would I say this, non-alien, non-citizens. And Puerto Rico in 1903, I believe, was considered to be an unincorporated territory. Now, an unincorporated territory is different from incorporated. At the time, let's say, of 1903, we had a territory, Hawaii, for instance, that would later come in as a state. It was an incorporated territory. It was ready to become kind of eligible for statehood. The insular cases determined that Puerto Rico would never have such status. As an unincorporated territory, its citizens were not allowed to vote for national elections. Now, they also have no true representation in the House of Representatives. They have observers. And these guys can vote on committees, but they can't vote for bills, yes or no. And so this really is a disenfranchisement, because those insular cases are today considered highly racist, very discriminatory toward Puerto Ricanos. The simple fact of the matter is they've formed the bulk of the United States policy ever since. And so I would agree that is a disenfranchisement. And until there's some kind of change in Puerto Rico's status, or the Virgin Islands, for instance, I think those statuses are going to stay in place.
Now, is Guam also an unincorporated?
It's correct. Yes, It is an unincorporated. There's one more incorporated territory. It's off of the Hawaiian Islands. When Hawaii became a state, they decided not to take the island in. But there's this little tiny island that can't get 60,000 residents on it, so it will never become a state. But it is incorporated territory.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. I don't think that I see any more questions anywhere. Thank you to our audience for your great questions, and thank you, Hamish, for spending a little extra time with us answering questions.
Thank you very much.
It's
Thank
great.
you for coming out.
We're glad to have you with us. This program will be on the Connecticut Network. It will be available to download. And I know, just watching in the audience, I felt like I felt two reactions. One, I felt that I learned new information about voting rights in our country. And secondly, I felt even more inspired to vote on Tuesday. And, I'll take my mask and I'll go and I'll wait in line.
That's right.
At a socially distanced, appropriate way.
And you can complain about it, as Mr. Colbert suggested.
That's right. I'll post on Facebook. Yes. Anyone can follow me. But we invite you to use your constitutional right and go out and vote if you have not already done so, because many people have already done that. We do invite you to join us again with Connecticut's Old State House with our upcoming November program. We're going to be looking a little bit at the theme of education, because it's something I think that's on a lot of our minds as we watch hardworking teachers, watch students navigate this virtual and hybrid world. So join us on November the 17th which is a conversation at noon, for a program with Kathy Fields, who's the executive director of the Litchfield Historical Society. She's going to be talking about the Litchfield Law School. And a couple days later, on November the 19th at 7 o'clock, join us for an evening conversation with Joni DiMartino from the Prince Crandall House. She's going to be talking about a clean slate, clearing room for the complete story of Crandall's Canterbury School, and she'll be discussing recent efforts that are going on to both restore the Prince Crandall's school, but to also bring in more of the stories of the students and make it a better, more well-rounded interpretation of the site. And then last but not least, join us on November the 30th at 3 o'clock for a legislative landmarks program. And we're going to be talking about the American School for the Deaf, which was incorporated here at Connecticut's Old State House. I have to say personally, it's really wonderful to be here in the building. And so we're glad you were able to join us here. I want to thank all of our viewers for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you at the next program. And please do remember to fill out the survey that you see in the description of the program, because we do look at them and get further ideas from all of your great comments. Thank you, and happy voting on Tuesday.
Thank you, folks. Good luck.